all these things I'm worried about, getting out of this depression and finding my purpose. I go, okay, well, I don't know what else to do. So I walked across the campus and a cold, empty, dark chapel, a door was open. And I walked down there and I said, I don't know if you are there or not, but if you are, I need help. Please help me. And the phone rang, and it was a fraternity brother of mine. Said, I don't know, it made me think of you. You're the last person I would think of, but we're having a Bible study at the fraternity house. And God showed up in my life, and that kind of changed everything. And that set me on this path to find what I was supposed to do.
Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to the Live Inspired podcast with John O'Leary. Today, we have a full docket because we are joined by a leadership coach, by a clinical psychologist, by a business owner, by a dad, by a husband, by a host of a national radio show, and by an author of dozens of books that have sold more than 20 million copies around the world. And no, we are not being joined by 7 different people. We're being joined today by just one. This gentleman and I shared the stage a couple times at Dave Ramsey events, and today he's going to join us to talk about setting boundaries, about necessary endings, and about saying yes to living in to the fullness of your life. My friends, I get to bring to you a friend of mine and a guy that I've read, a guy I look up to, and a guy that I'm excited to interview today. His name is Dr. Henry Cloud. Henry, welcome to Live Inspired with John O'Leary.
Hey man, I feel inspired already. Every time I'm around, something's better. I don't know what it is, but something just got better.
Well, Henry, you do the job of 7 different people at least. If you and I were to meet each other in maybe a party, and I introduced myself to you and told you a little bit about who I am and what I did, and you say, "Yeah, my name's Henry," and what do you follow with? So, Henry, what do you do? How do you describe yourself?
Seriously, that especially in recent years, I go, I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. Sometimes people say, you're an author, right? And I go, I'm really not an author. I mean, I've written a bunch of books, but I'm a practitioner and I write about what I work about. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and my first job as a clinician was in a leadership consulting firm. So they work with businesses and, CEOs and teams and cultures and all that. And they discovered, John, this is going to surprise you, but they discovered leaders have issues. So that was my first setting. So I was a clinician, but I'm in a leadership firm, and I came from a business family, and I love business, and I fell in love with leadership. So I've always had 2 parallel tracks to my work, one in the clinical world, one in the leadership space. And really what I found out early on was, we learn all this leadership stuff and strategy and execution and vision and all that, but then you got to go out in this place called reality.
Right.
And you're the one that has to do it. And so that's when our issues come into play. And my work became what I call the middle space. It's how humans function and how we're wired and how we, work interpersonally as well with our performance in business and teams and cultures and all that. And that's where I hang out.
Let's move away from where you hang out today. I'm going to push you back, I don't know, 25 years or so, way back to Vicksburg, Mississippi, March 17th. I think it was 1986. I don't know the exact date you were born, but sometime I'm assuming right around then, Henry. There's so many stories from your childhood that shape who you are. And I think probably the most powerful one in some regards is what happens with when you're 4 years of age. You wrote about it recently. It's powerful. So tell us what happens with your hip and leg and the pain around that when you're 4 years old. I think it's telling about who you become later on in life.
Well, I was floating along, I guess, a normal 3.5, almost 4-year-old, and I woke up one morning screaming in pain. And long story short, my parents took me obviously to the doctor, and they couldn't figure it out. And I was in the hospital right at the beginning, probably about a month, and had a lot of pain. I don't remember too much of that. I think I blocked most of it out, but they said it was pretty bad. And they were considering amputation. And so my mother had taken me to the appointment where they were discussing amputation, and the doctor was delayed and he wasn't coming in and all that. And as she tells it, she was in the waiting room and she heard a voice, like a literal voice, and it said, "Get up and leave and take him to Ochsner's Clinic in New Orleans." I mean, specifically Told her, take him to New Orleans, I think, and she knew what that meant. So she leaves and talks my otherwise reasonable father into driving 200 something miles to a totally unknown, what are we doing?
Right.
They check me in. I get randomly assigned to this woman, orthopedic oncologist, actually, and she examines me and does the x-rays and all that. And she comes back and says, well, there'll be no amputation. I know exactly what this is, and I know how to treat it. And so you're going to be in a wheelchair and in braces up to like a couple of years, and he's going to be okay. Well, it just so happened that doctor had just moved there from Chicago, where she trained with the two doctors that figured out how to treat this particular malady. And so I was in a wheelchair and in braces for almost a couple of years. And, you talk about the life shaping, I was the cripple kid, right? And I'm the one in the wheelchair at parties and can't go ride the pony and all that. And I think that did a lot of, as a shrink, I can tell you it's not good for your head. But I came out of it. I think what I did was I just dedicated the rest of my life to not being that cripple kid and went headlong into sports and pretty obsessive about it. I don't mean to sound weird, but I was a diver. I won the state championship. I won, the Southern stuff. And I actually was being recruited to start training for the Olympics. And then I was a golfer. My dad was a golfer. So I had started playing golf. And at about 12 or so, I realized that was my future. And so I became a competitive golfer, got recruited to play in college and all that. And I think the early part of my life just trying to prove I wasn't a crippled kid anymore. So
Mm.
little too obsessively goal oriented, we might say, and then I crashed and got glued back together, and so
Before you were 12 and before you were in college and before you crashed and got glued back together, there's a story you share when you were 4, maybe 5, maybe even a little bit older now. You're in splints and you're walking down some steps. And to set up the context of the story, my mom, when I came home from the hospital, I amputated fingers, unable to hold anything. She made dinner, my favorite meal. And the problem was I can't eat it, Henry. So my sister Amy grabs a fork and starts scooping the potatoes toward my mouth. And my mother says, Amy, drop the fork. If John's hungry, he will feed himself. And here's this, you use the word cripple. Here's this broken down, wheelchair bound, fingerless nobody in a wheelchair that can't do anything, can't eat, looking at his mom saying, like, what are you talking about, mom? I can't. And rather than even looking at me, she says to my sister again, Amy, drop the fork. If he's hungry, he'll feed himself. I wrote about that in a parenting magazine, and of any blog I've ever written, that one got the most negative pushback.
yep.
Parents, well-intended moms, mostly saying that's cruel and unusual to treat a child like that. So I think a lot about my mom and how,
Don't get me started on the parenting
well,
world out
dude,
there today. But
because you and I have the same mother. We had different fathers apparently because we have different last names. But dude, the way your mother greets you at the bottom of a stairwell, this little boy who's broken and needs someone to swoop him up and make it all go away. Would you share the story of your mom's tough love?
well, it says a lot about the difficulty of parenting and a lot about how parents sometimes have got to really do things that are not, not easy or not in their default way of operating. My mother's like, she was extremely codependent. I mean, she can't leave the dog out in the rain, right? She's always helping everybody. But the doctors had told them, do not give in to his, disability
All right.
because he'll use it. This is a kid. So you've got to make him do everything. And that just goes against my mother's grain, right? So, but she did it. I mean, I remember, if I ever put weight on my leg, I got in bad trouble. And we were at church one morning. Actually, there was this stairwell, to levels. And I'm going down the stairs and on my crutches, and I had a brace, and my left leg was with a strap over my shoulders, and it hung up behind my neck. And I slipped and went down the stairs, and I'm lying there, and my mother walks down and stands there while I got to hook myself up and get back up and keep going. And there are these two women behind us, and one of them says, can you believe how cruel that mother is not helping that child? And I remember that. I was writing a parenting book years later, and I remembered that story. And I called my mother. I said, how did you do that? You can't let anybody suffer. And she said, oh, I could never do that. I said, well, you did it. She said, I know, but I could never do that. I said, but you did it. How did you do it? And she said, Emmett. I said, Emmett. Well, Emmett was her best friend. She said every time I'd have to do something hard, I would call Emmett. Every day I'd have to call her and I'd cry. And she'd say, put the phone down, go do it, and come back. And I'd come back and cry. But, John, it speaks to how a lot of times life calls us to do things that are against our nature of how we're wired. But if we don't have Emmett, a lot of times we don't have it in us. And so it's important. Everybody, I always ask them when I talk about that, even teams or whoever, who's your Emmett? Because you're going to need Emmett.
Henry, for those of us who have no answer, I mean, you're blessed with a bunch of Emmets, and so am I. But I promise you, some of our viewers and listeners are thinking, dude, I don't have an Emmet in my life right now. What's either some encouragement to move through this time or some next right steps they can take to discover their Emmet or maybe to become an Emmet for someone else?
Yeah. Well, most times when we look at any scenario in our lives, what I've got to deal with and what steps I got to take, if it doesn't exist around you and in your life right now, and you say, oh, I got to go do that, well, you're probably not going to do it, or you would already be doing it. It would already be happening.
Hmm.
Okay. So it's either internal or it's external. Sometimes people don't have Emmets in their lives because they have Emmets that are around them, but they themselves aren't taking the step of leaning into expressing their need and being vulnerable and telling the Emmets that are already around you, I'm not doing okay. I need some help. Or I can't solve this problem, or I'm struggling with this project the boss just gave me, or I'm depressed, or whatever. So first thing we have to do is look at, am I the one that's not opening the door to the ones that are around me and are available? Other times, though, there are people, John, that really, there are no Emmets around them. I mean, your life is surrounded with a bunch of detached or, whatever kinds of people. And, you're not going to go down to Waffle House probably and just find one. Actually, if you're going to go anywhere and find one, it's probably the server at Waffle House. They are my hero. I love them so much.
Next
What's
time you
that?
and I are together in the same region, I'm taking you to the Waffle House. It is my
Oh,
favorite
man.
restaurant. And I don't know a whole lot of other guys who will park their car and walk in with me. So you are my guy, man. So next time we're together, I'm taking you to the Waffle House.
Oh, I fly in to speak somewhere, and the hosts are always like, they're going to take you somewhere fancy in this five-star hotel and this. And seriously, I don't know how many times I said, they said we have a breakfast, we're going. I go, do you have a Waffle House around somewhere? And they're kind of anyway. You might not have people around you who have the capacity, the emotional intelligence, the life wisdom or whatever. And so it's just like anything else. If we're not finding it around ourselves, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But you've got to go somewhere where that already exists and there's a structure to it.
Mm.
So therapists, they're good coaches, there are good groups, there are places that actually hang out a shingle and say, we are in the Emmett business and it is safe to come here.
Wow.
And a lot of times, that's what we need to do. And in all of our lives, John, we need to ask this question each day. Am I opening the door to what's available around me to help me get to the next step of performance or how I'm feeling or to solve a relationship problem? Am I opening the door and expressing my need for that? Or do I need to go find somewhere where that's why people are there? And that's where I would start.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that later on in life you had to get broken before you got glued back together. Part of the broken, and I'll speed us through this part of the story because I really want you to spend time talking about being glued back together. You're out at SMU, you're playing golf, but then you lose that opportunity. You're dating the love of your life, and then that relationship falls apart. So all these things that made you performatively excellent, all that you were, is now gone. You've lost your sense of self. You're at the bottom. You're what you would now describe probably as clinically depressed.
I mean, knowing what I know now, if I were me and I met me, I'd have put me in a hospital on day one. Yeah, it was really bad. I'd been recruited to play college golf, and that was my dream. And I had an injury, and I wasn't playing well because I had pain, and it was up and down. I'd play well, and then I wouldn't. And finally, into my sophomore year, I had to quit. I couldn't take the pain anymore, and I got really, really, really depressed. And so I hit bottom. And for a lot of you who you may be from a faith background and you might understand this, you might have been through it. I was a little bit more like the ones that aren't. I was just doing the college thing, right? And having a blast other than the struggles with my golf game. And I didn't know what to do. And so one day, I this may be more than some people want to hear, but I didn't know what to do. I mean, I didn't know how to get out of this hole. And how do you make life work? And how do you find a relationship that works? And how do you find a career? What am I going to do for a living? And all of that kind of stuff. And I'm sitting in my dorm room and I look up on the shelf and my Bible's sitting there, which I hadn't read, since there's something about I don't know your fraternity, but my fraternity parties, we didn't read the Bible a lot at those parties.
Well, I'm glad you had it in your dorm room. I'm not sure I know a whole lot of kids in fraternity houses who have the old Bible up there. And hopefully you were getting
Well,
that through osmosis.
I don't know. One of those weirdos that comes and knocks on your door might have given it to me for all I know. But I just had this feeling, I don't know how to explain it, but I kind of got drawn to it. And I picked it up and opened it up. And this verse just kind of, you've heard jumped off the page. And it said, I'll paraphrase, seek God first, and all these things will be added unto you. And I went, wait a minute. All these things I'm worried about, like getting out of this depression and finding my purpose and all, and what? I go, okay, well, I don't know what else to do. So I walked across the campus and a cold, empty, dark chapel, a door was open. And I walked down there and I said, I don't know if you are there or not, but if you are, I need help.
Mm.
Please help me. And John, I don't know how to describe it other than it was the loneliest moment of my life because I finally jumped out of the plane. It's like one of those people on TV, they run an altar and they get zapped, right? Well, nothing happened. It was like silence. And I went, oh my gosh, if there's no help from, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And I walked back to my dorm room and the phone rang and it was a fraternity brother of mine said, I don't know, it made me think of you. You're the last person I would think of, but we're having a Bible study at the fraternity house. And I went to invite you. And God showed up in my life and that kind of changed everything. And that set me on this path to find what I was supposed to do. But one of the things that I first found out was because I was cool with the guy, but I just didn't like his friends.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, when I was growing up, I kind of had this sort of, I grew up in a home that went to church, but they weren't really ballistic about it, just a normal Methodist Southern family. And my parents were involved, but they weren't like, these heavy-handed Christians. And I had all those friends. And then I had my regular friends, what I call them, my regular friends. And I was much more like them. And, than these people seemed weird to me. Some of them couldn't go to the prom. Before adulthood, sneak out and have some adult beverages. They didn't do any of those things. And so I just thought God's friends were weird. That's what I mean. And so I had always kind of,
What
but when I
changed?
got into the faith, I found out he wasn't like them either. So that kind of helped to find out I could be a normal person. He was much more interested in some deeper things than all that.
Why does this kid who's no longer swinging the golf clubs, no longer dating that girl, shift ultimately into clinical psychology? So you're at
Well,
SMU. How did that come about?
I always thought if I didn't pursue a career in the golf world somewhere, I'd go to law school. And probably because I grew up around a bunch of lawyers and they were cool and we duck hunted and played golf and I liked, Matlock or something. And so, and I
We'll
was
have to
interested
Google
in
for
it.
the younger audience. We'll Google that later on today, and it will all make sense.
Yeah, for the
Matlock.
grandparents, look up Perry Mason. There you go. So that's what I thought it'd be. But then what happened was I started reading a lot, because I was getting out of this depression. And I got really interested. I was a businessman. I was an accounting and finance major. And I got really interested in the stuff that I would read, both in theology and in psychology. And long story short, but God made it very clear, change your major and go into psychology. And I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I was an accounting and finance major. I'm a junior at this time.
Right.
So I did not know what I was headed into. I just knew through a variety of experiences he was telling me to go that way. It was undeniable, and that's what I did. And so I stepped out, and here we are.
The old Steve Jobs quote that I'm going to butcher talks about when you're stepping into life, it makes very little sense, but it makes perfect sense looking back on it.
Hmm.
And as I look back on your life, you have all these unusual experiences. And yet, looking back on it, it has led perfectly to this podcast, to your life, to your success, to your babies, like to the best of who you are. It's this scattered, odd journey along the way. And one of the more unusual things is you were told by a young teacher, essentially, that you're a pathetic speaker. You're never going to amount to anything. You'll never be a lawyer. It's probably one of the reasons why you chose not to do that, because in middle school, you were told it would never happen because you can't public speak.
Right.
All of that is level setting to say, and then a decade and a half later, you're working out and you have an encounter with someone who
Oh
says
gosh.
that teacher might be wrong.
Do you want me to tell about that?
Yeah, well, I can't go any farther. I'm out of rope.
Well, when I was in the like eighth grade, maybe I got up to give an oral book report. I didn't have a problem with that. I'd been in school plays and all that, and somehow I got flustered, and then I got anxious, and then I got more flustered, and then I got really anxious, and I literally couldn't talk in the halfway through the book report, and the teacher said, "Sit down." And I sat down and she said, "You know, you will never be successful in life if it involves anything with speaking because you just can't do it. You said might want to be a lawyer. You'll never be a lawyer because you can't talk in front of people." And I was, I don't know, we use the word today, traumatized. I wouldn't use that when it's compared to what you went through or even some of what I went through as a child, but it really affected me. And I could not, from that moment, I could not speak in front of people. And I would always avoid it, and I almost didn't graduate senior year because you had to give an oral book report in English to finish the year. And I said, flunk me. And I was headed to SMU to play golf. And I said, I'm not doing it. And she let me give the book report to her after class. I mean, I literally, it wasn't no, I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I could not talk. Went through college, never did it. Went through graduate school, never did it. And I'm in practice a couple of years out of graduate school. I'm in my 20s. And I went to the gym working out one day. And this big naked guy walks up to me, and I'm on my way to the showers. Now, this is back, at the time where, nowadays in gyms, everybody covers themselves. Well, back then it wasn't like that. And now I'm going to go off script here for a second, and you can delete this if you want, but I was
This
telling
whole
this.
story is being deleted, Cloud. So you just go as far off base as you want, man. We're not airing this part of the podcast.
I was speaking in an arena of women one day, and I was telling this story, and I slipped. I didn't do this on purpose, but I said, and this big naked guy walks up to me, and he was huge. And then I realized what I said. Now, I mean, tall. The guy was really tall. My wife is on the front row, and the jumbotron goes down, and she's like covering her head, shaking. Anyway, well, it turned out he had played defensive end for the Rams. I mean, he was a big, big guy. And this guy walks up out of nowhere, and he says to me, "Are you a Christian?" And I'm like, "Yeah. Why?" And he says, "Now, this is a true story. This guy didn't know me from Adam." He says, "Because God just told me to tell you something." And I'm like, "Well, I'm a psychologist too. I can make those voices go away. We can help this." He said, "No, I'm serious. I'm a pastor, and I'm telling you, God just told me to tell you something." And so I said, "All right." So we went next door and sat down and have coffee. And here's what he told me. He said, "God told me that when you were a kid, something happened to you that made you afraid to speak in front of people. And he wants you to begin to speak for him. And he's going to open some doors and you're to walk through them."
Hmm.
And that's what changed it. And I mean, it wasn't immediate. I struggled through the first attempt. It probably took me a year and a half before I could do it comfortably, but that's how it changed.
Henry Cloud has shared the stage with some of the biggest names in the world. He's been on some of the largest stages in the world. He's deserved and earned that because he's incredibly gifted at speaking now. And he's also sold more than 20 million copies of his books. It's pretty remarkable what can happen in a locker room with a guy when you're willing to say yes and take the coffee across the street after you get your clothes back on. So, Henry, listen, man, I've read many of your books. I've taken notes in all of the books that I have read. I'm going to walk you through some of the quotes from some of the books. We're going to
Uh-oh.
be out of time, man. But Tell me what you're telling me. All right. So I'm just going to read you back some of my favorite quotes and then tell me what are you really saying here? Here we go. You cannot grow to your full potential without pruning away what is holding you back. What are you really saying to me?
Well, that's from my book, Necessary Endings. And, I work with extreme high performers and, from CEOs of big public companies everybody would know of to professional sports figures you would know of. And this context is really a lot in business, but I would run into these extreme performers who, as powerful as they were and hard decisions all the time, there were a lot of times there'd be one something they needed to have a necessary ending. They needed to fire that person or drop that strategy or shut down that business unit or whatever. They continue to have hope it's going to change and it's not. And I got really interested in why can't we do that? And so the quote is basically, I think in the first sentence of the book, I said something, today may be the biggest enemy of your tomorrow. And life, we gather stuff and get connected to stuff which may have fit for a season, but it doesn't fit what we're trying to do. And I call it pruning. And if we can't let go of something, that's what's holding you back. And a lot of times it's hard to pull the trigger on that stuff. There's people involved, there's emotions, there's all of that, but there's some things they may be very negative things, a non-performer on your team, a toxic relationship, or some whatever negative things, and you're not going to get where you're going to get to as long as that person's around. Or it may be something that was really good, but it's not the best, and it's got to be pruned because it is going to keep you. And the operative question there, John, is what exists in my life today that doesn't fit my tomorrow?
Mm.
And if it doesn't, we got to sometimes have some tough decisions. I give you an example. Your mother looked at you on that first meal, and she had a vision for your life, apparently. And somebody feeding you did not fit that future. So she said, no, that's not, we're going to end that before it starts.
So good. And I love the term you use, pruning. It's not the hacksaw, man. It's just pruning. It's pruning the good to make it better. Another quote that I wrote down, when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing, we change. And this is a quote I actually used last night with a family friend of mine who is nearing pain that will become so great that the change will come. And I used that quote rather than waiting for that. What if you could be a little bit more
Yeah.
proactive in it? So again, one more time, the quote, when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing, we'll finally change.
Well, we don't like pain. We don't step into it. Everything in us is wired to move away from pain. We're just wired that way. R.D. Lang, he said it something like this. He said, pain is unavoidable, but the only pain that is avoidable, and perhaps some of the worst pain that we have, is the pain that comes from trying to avoid pain.
Mm.
And so generally, if we're going through something difficult, John, it's not going to be an easy, one step forward and I'm going to feel better. It means to get out of something difficult, we're going to have to take some kind of difficult steps that are involved in making this better. For some people, it may be just finally opening up about it. It may be getting help. It may be, whatever it is. But there's going to be a pain involved in getting rid of the pain. That's the concept. And when you figure out that, okay, I'm going to cry uncle, enough, I'll do it. That's the moment. And here's what we learn with wisdom over the years. If I've got something really painful and difficult, I got a nagging tooth in life, I'm not going to wait till I need a root canal.
Right.
Step into the difficult pain now before you have no choice anymore.
Yes.
That's the wisdom road. The wisdom road is to choose pain that ends pain,
Mm.
period, until the pain ends our ability to choose anymore. And if we could do that every day, then, oh man, would life be different? But we don't choose broccoli when we're 2 years old.
Or 19, 17, 15, and 13 if you're the O'Leary kids, apparently. All right. So another quote, Henry. This one's about relationship. I know so much of your work ultimately is about relationship, but this one just gets right after it. The extent to which two people in a relationship can bring up and resolve issues is a critical marker of the soundness of a relationship.
Oh, I said that?
You did, brother. Boundaries face to face.
That's not bad. Yeah. It, look at it this way. You're driving down the road and there's this pothole and you're trying to get somewhere and there's a pothole in front of you. And if your car is phobic of potholes and it can't go to it to figure out how to get around it, you're not going to get to where you want to go.
Right.
But we got to have the shock absorbers to get through that bumpy patch. And any relationship, a board and the CEO, the CEO and the executive team, the people and their direct reports, the customers, the investors, the stakeholders, all of that. Generally, we come together because oxytocin is flowing, the bonding chemicals. Oh, I found the deal. I found the investor. I found the employee. I found the girl. I found whatever it is. And it's great. That's what causes. Nobody ever went to the altar at a wedding and said, I can't wait till I hate your guts and only our attorneys are talking to each other. Nobody ever did that. It starts out good. And then you run into, the issues that come up, sometimes because of internal things, sometimes whatever. If we haven't created John Gottman, the marriage researcher, calls it a bubble of safety.
Hmm.
That a good relationship has a bubble of psychological safety around it. I work with teams a lot to develop this. A bubble of safety where we have, with each other, we have the safety and the skills to put stuff out on the table without it causing a worse problem. Having problems is not dysfunction.
Right.
Dysfunction is when we try to exert energy to address a problem, and that creates a bigger problem we had to begin with. So people get defensive and attacking and move away and avoid it and, all this. If we haven't created the safety to how will we talk to each other? How will we become, we're sitting across the table at each other or whatever, or have different perspectives. How do we get on the same side of the table and the problem be on the other side?
How do you do that, Henry? I mean, honestly, man, whether it's a couple yelling at one another over the trash, a parent yelling at a child over the homework, to colleagues professionally yelling about that thing, to people who view life differently politically, putting different yard signs in their front yard and getting mad about that. How do you come around that and actually sit on the same side of the table?
Well, the first thing you got to do is you got to figure out, look, I can't control the other person, right? It really takes two to fight. And so, how do I need to look at me and my reactions and how they are either contributing to this or getting in the way of solving it,
That's
right?
awesome.
And so, it's really hard to have an argument by yourself. So when I decide if they're going to argue, they're going to be arguing with themselves. It's not going to be me. Then you got to figure out, and if that's the case, if I'm causing it, the first step is, you know what, we got this problem, and I just got to tell you, I've been thinking about it, and I think when we talk about it, I make it worse.
Mm.
And I just want to tell you, I don't think I've been listening. I mean, I don't know if I agree or whatever when we talk, but I do know that when we've talked, I've been more interested in convincing you or telling you you're wrong or negating you or minimizing the pain you're going through or whatever than I have been in trying to understand. So I just want to listen and understand why you feel the way you feel. That's the first thing. Now, that kind of presupposes that, and that'll actually turn a lot of, as Proverbs says, a soft answer turns away wrath, that sometimes that just the getting out of that fighting mode that'll reduce the amygdala hijacking in the other person's brain where they actually can get to a higher
Yes.
level. That's how the hostage negotiators get people to put down the bomb. They don't go in and try to convince, oh, dude, this is dumb. Don't do that. They go in and ask them their name, say, tell me how we got here today.
Yeah.
Tell me your perspective. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you may find, and in my book, Necessary Endings, I wrote about there's three different kinds of people broadly. Wise people, Proverbs says, correct a wise person and they will thank you for it. They'll love you for it. They'll change their behavior. But there's another group called the fool or the mocker, and it says, do not confront a mocker lest you incur insults upon yourself. They're going to be defensive. They're going to be attacking. They're going to gaslight you, all of that. And you might have to figure out, you know what, I talking about this with this person probably isn't going to get anywhere.
Right.
So then that's where we make a shift. And what I say in the book is, especially with bosses, to tell people, John, we talked about this problem a lot. I brought it up several times, and I'm not going to do that anymore. I don't want to get on your case about this issue anymore. I want to have a different kind of conversation. And that conversation is, I'm not going to talk to you about the problem anymore because I've learned that talking with you about the problem doesn't help. And so now I got to figure out what I'm going to do. If talking doesn't help, what are we going to do? And I can't expose myself to A, B, C, or D, to you missing another deadline, or we not having a product launch that works, or you dividing the team, or whatever, or at home, can't expose myself to your passing out drunk anymore, and the kids. I can't control that, but I can make a decision to not expose myself to it anymore.
Hmm.
So we're gonna move to some consequences potentially, and you can choose whether or not you want to try to work this out and start to change it, or you're gonna have to go do it somewhere else. And that's where the harder work of boundaries and necessary endings begins to happen. And a lot of times in that scenario, if somebody truly is impossible, then you give them a choice to come to the table and fix it, or you get to choose, whether you want to be here or not. But at that point, John, I would tell people and usually good people get sideways because they're acting out their own woundedness or whatever, go get a third person. I mean, you got to have, get a marriage counselor, get a coach, get somebody to come into, that's what I did. I go into teams where they're, because you got to have a dialysis machine where there's somebody taking all this toxicity and metabolizing it and giving something good to where they can work with. Sometimes I've told couples before, look, I don't want you talking about this topic by yourselves. Marriage is an adult contract, and when you guys talk about money or sex or the kids, there's no adult in the room.
Hmm.
So you can only talk about this when I'm with you, because sometimes people, they don't have the skills or they're too wounded. So get a third party to help you.
Henry Cloud, I wrote down 25 quotes. I'm not going to get through all of them because we will be 4 hours into the podcast. So let me ask you the final quote right now. And I saved this for last because I knew I wanted to get to it. We live in a world right now with so much despair, and we're at each other's throats and we're at our own throat. And I think in part because of what this quote speaks to. So here we go. Where there is no vision for tomorrow, there is no power in today.
John, when we're done here, why are you going to go to the next room? You know, if you don't have some sort of and my way of describing a vision is a desired future state. It starts with the desire. We get out of bed in the morning because we're hungry or want to go do something, somebody I want to meet with, or for me, I want to go play golf, or there's got to be some want to. And a lot of people, John, they've lost touch with what they really want. And we're, the Bible says that our path comes from our heart and then God directs our steps. Sometimes people, to have power today, we got to sit down and say, is what I have what I really want? If it is, great. You got the power to go keep doing it. Pour fuel on the fire. It's going great. But if something's broken, you got to get in touch with, what would you like for it to look like? What do you want your marriage to look like? What do you want your family to look like? What do you want this team to look like? What do you want the results to look like? What do you want the P&L to look like? And we got to really start with that. And future means we got to really understand this does not exist today. And to have it, some things have got to happen. And desired future state. State means I really believe that this can exist. And Martin Luther King said, I see a day. That wasn't a fantasy. He believed that could really exist. And the number one factor that loads on reaching any goal is not motivation, it's the belief that it can be done.
Right.
And so that's where we start. And if you have that, if you think it can be done and it's something that you want, then you're headed somewhere. But without a vision, without knowing what we want in life, it's like, when Alice in Wonderland comes to the Cheshire Cat and the fork in the road and says, which way do I go? And the cat goes, well, where are you trying to get to? And she goes, I don't know. And he said, well, I guess it doesn't matter that much, does it? Well, a lot of people are getting up and doing life every day just kind of as they're wired. And we don't take enough time to, I mean, even tomorrow, when I put my head on the pillow tonight, what do I want to look back at the day and say, that was good. I got a step further, or we did this or whatever. And all life is a bunch of those stacked up together. And if we don't think enough about where we want something to be, not going to be a lot of power in today. We're just kind of running on autopilot.
Henry, you recently wrote a book for your friends.
I laugh. Yeah, I did. Very different book than I've ever written.
I'm curious, ignoring the folks who follow you more broadly, but you wrote this for actual friends.
Yeah.
What has the response of your actual friends been to your most recent book?
Well, a lot of them, they're like really surprised that, well, to help people understand the book. So I'm a person of faith, but I work in business environments and let's call them secular environments a lot. And a lot of my friends, we moved recently, but we lived in West LA for 25 years, and all my friends in Beverly Hills and all those areas, you know, it's not like living in the Bible Belt, right? And so they always knew I was one of those weirdos. And but it's an uncomfortable conversation to have with a lot of people. But we're good friends. And so finally I just said, you know what? I'm going to write a book to my friends to explain how I can be one of those. Why do I really believe this stuff?
Mm.
That's what the book is about. And so what I hear back from them is the first thing is I have to tell my story about when I hit bottom and how God intervened. And the first thing was they were they said, I never knew you went through all that. And that was a big response. But with others, one of the things that it helps them to see is what people believe about Jesus or about the Bible. What they believe is what they hear. And in the book, I talk about what I had to learn was a lot of this Christian stuff has nothing to do with the Bible or the faith. It's just a bunch of religion that, people came up with. And the other thing was a lot of the people that we think are really those weird Christians, they're the people that Jesus was the most upset with. He didn't like them either. I mean, and so they're kind of going, "Oh, this is different than I thought." And my hope is that they'll be able to find how good God is. But a lot of barriers to that in what we see around us. Some of that's people.
Dr. Henry Cloud, I could sit and visit with my buddy for all day long plus some. So I look forward to the next visit. But we wrap up every podcast run here with what we call the Live Inspired Seven. Seven rapid fire questions and answers. So let's get ready to
Uh-oh.
together. Get your golf cleats on, man. Time up tight. Here we go.
I don't do anything rapid. I'm not good at that.
Take your time, buddy. Here we go. What's been the most impactful book you've ever read?
Oh gosh. Well, I got to say the Bible, but I mean, that's kind of like, what's your favorite golf course you ever played? Augusta? I mean,
Right.
there's certain things that kind of go over there. The most impactful is sort of like, do you like air, water, or food better? It's hard to get to that one. But I would say one of them for sure was a book called No Man is an Island by Thomas Merton. That was one of them for sure. I don't even know what this book says now, but for some reason it really impacted me when I was first starting out, was The Spirit of Enterprise by George Gilder.
Wow.
It was back I read it later. I read it in graduate school, but I mean, I could go on with a bunch of them, but gosh, if people go read Peter Drucker's Management, you ever read that?
No.
Unbelievable.
Huh.
Unbelievable.
Well, I'll be checking it out.
I got to give you one, and this is going to show you what a nerd I am. But one of my main mentors in life was a Jewish psychiatrist named Otto Kernberg. And I would have to say this is one of the most impactful books of my life. It was Borderline Conditions and Pathological Narcissism because he explains character structure. And everything we do really comes down to the architecture of how we're glued together. So that was
Hmm.
another one.
Well, guys, it looks like we got our library list to go hit up now. So we got 4 books on it, and I'll make sure I have a copy of all those links below in the
I'll try
show.
to be faster on the other questions.
We'll run. So what's one positive characteristic, one positive trait that you possessed as a little boy growing up in Vicksburg that you wish you exhibited as brilliantly today?
Oh, something I lost, I guess is what you're asking, right?
That's right.
You know, I don't know if I've lost it and I probably have, or it's just kind of we get so encumbered with everything around us. But it was probably impulsivity.
Hmm.
You know, see something, want to do it, and go do it. It's like, and now there's so much that's kind of prescribed that I notice there's a lot of things I used to just impulsively go chase, which I should be doing more of. Playing the drums, bass fishing. Hey, it's good weather outside. Let's go fishing.
Number three, man, with the bass fishing in front of us, if your home caught fire and all living things are out, and you have an opportunity of running back into your home and grabbing one thing that matters, Henry Cloud, what would you grab?
So my family and my dog are out.
Yep.
Well, I've actually had that happen, and this was before we had photos, in the cloud. Is when your most meaningful moments were in frames, right, and actual pictures. And when that happened to me with some of the California fires back when, they said you got 20 minutes, get out of here. Fireman knocking at the door, and I ran back through, and I remember replaceable, 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 replaceable. And the only thing that was left was my German Shepherd and some pictures because it's pictures. And I learned something, John, that what the pictures were, the only thing is eternal,
Mm,
and that is love. And it's the people and experiences that I love.
gosh,
And
man.
so,
We spend so much time collecting garbage.
yeah,
And when the fires burn over the hillside and the firefighters knock on the door and say, brother, you got 20 minutes, you get the kids, you get your spouse, you get the photos, you get the dog, and you get out. Everything else burns and you grab the marshmallows, like,
it's
I mean,
replaceable.
right on. If you could sit on a bench on a gorgeous day and have a long conversation with anyone living or deceased, who would you like to be next to?
Okay, I got to take Jesus out of there. I'm one of those weirdos, right? Well, I actually got to do that once. I did get to spend a day with Jack Nicklaus playing golf and got to ask him everything. And he was my idol growing up. But I would, there's so many, but I think it would be Freud. Freud gets trashed because nobody reads his original works. They just read the caricatures but he came up with the big concepts that everything's built around. He's the one that came up with the personality actually having a structure to it.
Hmm.
He's the one that came up that we have drive to connect, the drive to move forward and aggressively pursue things. He's the one that came up with the concept of the unconscious. He's the one that came up with you push something down, it squirts out over here. He's the one that really laid the seeds for our understanding that our character structure comes from a dyad of a relationship. And I would like to know in 1900,
All right, man.
how did you do that?
We so take for granted the great minds that have come before us.
Yeah.
So you're partying with Freud. Next question. What's the best advice Freud, your mother, or Jack Nicholson, or anybody else ever gave you? So the best,
Not Nicholson, Nicholas.
what's about,
I don't know. I mean, Nicholson plays golf, I think, because I've heard about
probably
it.
not as well as Jack Nichols.
No, not as well. No.
What's the best advice any of those folks or anybody else ever gave you?
I've heard this in a thousand different ways, but really, I'll paraphrase it. My dad used to say, son, it's all about people.
Hmm.
And it is. The good things in our lives usually come from the right people. They show up with love, they show up with support, they show up with opportunity, they show up with correction,
Hmm.
show up with wisdom. And it's all about the people. And that behooves us to get good with people. When you
Right.
learn that it's about them and we have a deep desire and curiosity, I want to know this person. I want to know about them. I want to know what makes them tick. Then we're well down the road into a good relationship.
What advice would you give yourself if you could go back in time to that junior at SMU? So if you could whisper some wisdom your way at age 20 or so, what would you say?
Dude, it's going to be a lot harder than you think, but it's going to be worth it.
Mm.
So when it gets hard, take the next step.
Dr. Henry Cloud, my friend, it has been said that all great people can have their lives summed up in one sentence. How would you like yours to read?
If you don't believe that God can do something of value with a mess, then look at this guy.
Dr. Henry Cloud, leadership coach, clinical psychologist, business owner, father, husband, host of a national radio show, author of 4 dozen books, selling more than 20 million copies, and a great and mighty friend. I thank you for doing something with your mess and reminding us that we can too.
Yeah. Well, uh, my messes don't even come close to what you went through, John. And if anybody has a message that no matter how hard it gets to take the next step and it'll all be worth it, that's you. And so all of us are great. I mean, we're here today because of how you've walked that path. So thank you.
My friends, that is the voice of a legendary coach and human being, Henry Cloud. My name is John O'Leary. Today is our day. It is a gift. Live inspired.